Good morning, everybody. Welcome to the stream. Let's get this going. All right. You guys may have seen there was a little bit of struggle before the stream, updating software and packages. Um, I'm getting started a little bit later today than I wanted to. Um, well, not the stream, but just with getting things going. Um, Yesterday, my youngest was competing in dance, and her team did amazing. Um, one of their dances was the top dance of the night, um, and won their team won a bunch of awards for it, and their studio won a bunch of awards. It was a good night for her. Um, really exciting. Um, so I'm still excited about that. Um, and then as you guys may have seen, as I was struggling a bit before the stream, yeah, it looks like the version of PNPM I've been using is a bit out of date. Um, I use Volta as my package manager, and I actually really love Volta. It's a really good package manager. Um, the only the only thing I have to do is remember that um, I need to pin my versions of things. So you guys may have seen before the stream, we were on version 9.6, and after some changes this morning, now we're pinned to version 10.6.3. Um, So we're good there. Unfortunately, we're a bit behind on upgrading just Angular and NX and a few things like that. So we'll get started with that this morning. Last week, if you guys were here, we actually went through a bunch of package management stuff, and towards the end, my builds were pretty messed up. I think the reason my builds were messed up was the same reason that after I upgraded NPM, it recognized that it had to rebuild my whole node modules directory. Um, and so there's a bit of that. Um, let's see. Let's see what's left to migrate, right? While we're doing that, let's make sure. Um, I was looking at the wrong thing this morning. No, it wasn't. It just switched to the last one. Okay. Like, oh no, I made a new branch in the wrong place. But no, we're good. Um, upgraded NX. Um, there's a whole bunch of people out in front of my house this morning. I'm not sure what's going on, but oh well. Um, anyway, if we take a look, we've got Angular. It's a patch migration. We'll go ahead and take care of that. Um, so let's just let's let's see what we've got. NCU. That's the one we're looking for. Hey, Michael. Welcome to the stream, man. Good to see you. So we've got, it looks like this is just normal Angular stuff, router schematics. Yeah. So we'll go ahead and migrate this. enpm exec nx migrate. Um, and we'll start with Angular CLI as we always do. Then we'll do core and then schematics. Storybook Angular is unlikely to have um, it's unlikely to have migrations that need to run. So we'll let that one be. Um, we'll do it just through the regular NCU migrations. Um, and yeah, that should get us to where we can launch the application. And once we get that launched, we can see where we are, what we need to do to move forward. We were in the middle of building that resource, so we'll be pulling up that resource and see what's going on. No migrations, that's good. npm exec nx migrate Angular core, and then schematics. Um, then the last bit is just using NCU to run the rest of our installations. So, yeah, I mean, it's been crazy in Utah. We've been getting snow for the past few days, which very strange. I mean, I'm looking out my window. The snow line is very low on the mountains. Down in the valleys, we still don't have snow on the ground. Um, but it was snowing last night as I was coming home from my daughter's dance competition. Um, for those of you guys that don't know, the day started early for my daughter. Um, so Friday night, um, she was competing in a duo with one of her friends, and their duo, um, they got first place in their category, but then they got the high point overall for their duo. And high point overall means that they got the highest scoring duo for their age category. Um, so she went to that early in the morning, um, and was really excited. And then they went, and my daughter's favorite style of dance is lyrical. Hey, Ole, managed to migrate to Tailwind 4 and everything is working well. Do you need to use plain CSS files for Tailwind 4? Were you using SCSS with Tailwind? Um, Whenever I do Tailwind, I only use CSS. But that's awesome. That's really good advice too. Um, so pnpm exec nx migrate schematics slash Angular. Anyway, she was disappointed because her favorite dance style they took second place in, but their jazz, their jazz was amazing. When I watched her dance that last night, it was amazing to watch. So I um, enjoy going and watching my daughters compete because it's basically everything they've done for the past year. Um, they've been working hard and learning stuff, and it all comes together, and it's amazing to watch. Um, but yeah, it was a lot of fun yesterday. A lot of fun last night. It was the first time I'd seen her dances, so just a lot of fun for me. Um, all right, we upgraded Angular, created Angular, and commit that and push it. And so the last thing to do is just to check um, what we've got left to upgrade. What do I think about the Tailwind's decision to go CSS only in V4? I will tell you right now, modern CSS is way more capable than I think a lot of people realize. And so you can nest CSS, which whenever I've introduced like SCSS or SAS into a project, it's almost always been for nesting purposes, right? I very rarely use any of their looping or things like that. Um, so I've been using pure CSS and Angular for a long time now. Um, I if I don't add SCSS, then I don't need the preprocessor for my stuff, right? So it didn't really affect me. I actually think it's a smart move. Um, like the preprocessors were amazing, but the tooling, like the actual CSS is catching up to adding the stuff that the preprocessors had. We're supposed to be getting like CSS variables, not like CSS properties, right? A lot of people call CSS properties variables, but like true variables. That there's a specification for that out there right now. And there's a bunch of other specifications that make like SCSS and less and things like that less necessary. If you're using looping, right, then you still need to use SCSS. Um, so my feeling is I think it's a good direction to take their framework. And if you can't do that now, um, then you can stick around on version 3 until you can get there. Um, but it might be very similar to like the Bootstrap um, version 3 to version 4 change, where there were a lot of people on version 3 for years after it happened, right? Um, so I don't know. I feel good about it, but I also understand why people may not like it. It's a good question. The rest of this stuff we can just upgrade through. Yeah, we can just upgrade through NCU. Um, except for NG extension, we'll upgrade NG extension through the migrations. Um, but we'll go ahead and upgrade these dependencies, and then we'll migrate NG extension. Um, I don't believe we're using NG extension yet. Hey, no problem. I mean, I'm full of opinions. You're free to ask for them anytime you want, right? Um, my daughters will definitely tell you I'm full of opinions. Have plenty of opinions to share. Um, but yeah, we'll get this migration done. While this is going, let's take a look. I did upgrade that. WebStorm did finish. Um, Tailwind says don't use preprocessors with Tailwind. Yeah, you shouldn't use Tailwind with Sass for the same reason you shouldn't use Sass with Stylus. Yeah, like it wasn't CSS. What do you mean, race peace day? What wasn't CSS? Um, but yeah, like I kind of feel about SCSS and less the way I felt about jQuery towards the end of when I stopped using jQuery. For a very long time, jQuery was extremely necessary to work on the web. Um, right? If you wanted to write anything on the web, you would use jQuery. And to this day, jQuery still has way more code out there than React, Angular, Vue, any of the major frameworks combined, right? There's just way more jQuery out there, just because it was so necessary. And there's so much stuff that still runs on jQuery. Um, kind of feel like SCSS and less the same way. Um, the, we're nearing the end of their usefulness. They introduced some powerful concepts to CSS, and it allowed people to see what CSS could be, um, and how it could work. But we don't really need that. We don't really need the preprocessors anymore, because CSS is caught up so well. Again, the one place where CSS is behind, well, there's two places, right? Actual variables, right? You can't use actual variables without a preprocessor right now. And again, that's not the dash dash properties, right? The CSS properties, but I mean actual variables that you declare in in SCSS. I mean, you can use those variables as part of variable, like as part of property names and things like that. And then the other place where it hasn't caught up yet is like in looping. Yeah. Oh yeah. Yeah. Before document.query. Yeah. Yeah. Before document.query selector all existed. Oh man. Um, like if you tried to write your own selectors before jQuery, or like if you tried not to use something like MooTools or Prototype or jQuery, or there were so many tools that did similar things. And just the little tweaks that you had to do, because Internet Explorer 9 did it slightly different than 10, that did it slightly different than 11, and you know, you've got like Firefox and Chrome do it the same, except in this weird case, and you've got Safari out there just being Safari, trying to take over as the IE. It just needed IE to die before it could take over as the IE of the internet. Um, so it was a mess. So yeah, document.query selector all. Um, there's not a lot of new jQuery. But if you go look at any of the internet sites that go out and track what sites are written in, um, jQuery still dwarfs everything by far. Um, it's still not even a real competition. We should go look that up. Um, Query selectors, the dollar sign, and yeah, um, that's an interesting idea. Yeah, well, and most of those old sites don't have to be maintained as much, so they aren't really hiring devs to maintain them, right? Uh, but let's go look up those stats. I like SCSS tokens and material. It's not as easy currently to know the underlying vars. And that's the thing, Michael, right? Like the tokens and the vars, and the fact that you can use the preprocessor to create all your themes for you, whereas with CSS you'd have to download specific themes and things like that, right? Um, there are places where the preprocessors still win out, and you pointed out one really, really well. Um, so let's just look at the last one. Actually, let's go ahead and create dependencies. Push that. And I can't even remember why we added ng extension. Do you guys remember? I know it had something to do with the package stuff we were looking at last week. But it was a good library to add, regardless of why we did it. I just can't remember the reasoning behind it. So yeah, we've just got ng extension. So we're gonna pnpm exec nx migrate ng extension. jQuery, man, like you're bringing back horrible memories. IE6 was probably one of the worst things. Um, IE6 was Uh, IE6 was still part of Microsoft's embrace, extend, extinguish. And man, IE6, and I don't think even Microsoft wants to talk about IE7 anymore. It was a horrible version, right? Um, I think CSS properties are kind of awful compared to SCSS, or less variables. Scrolling hundreds of properties until you reach some global styles can't be an innovation. Or so CSS properties are um, They're a game changer. Um, and they allow us to do some really cool stuff. So like let's go ahead and commit this. Um, so we upgraded ng extension. And then we'll take a look at some cool things we can do with CSS properties that we're actually doing um, in our Sudoku game right now, right? We'll go ahead and serve this. But I did generate mat palette with CSS variables and moved my tokens to CSS variables as well. I left only form density in the SCSS. Yeah, jQuery crashed and yep. But I think no one cared. It's probably true. Everybody probably had a bad taste in their mouth from IE6, and IE7 was just a mess. Because NG extensions are goated. Absolutely, totally correct. Good old times using Bootstrap and a custom variables out of SCSS. Oh man, Bootstrap and SCSS were so good together. Bootstrap was my go-to CSS framework for a very long time. In fact, I was one of the late adopters to Tailwind. I didn't really understand what Tailwind was, and I'll be honest, I was one of the Tailwind haters. It took Chow showing me Daisy UI for me to go, oh wow, this is amazing. Um, yeah, you're bringing back good memories with Bootstrap there. Working on an issue now. I fixed some IE6 and IE7 CSS bugs with Vanilla.js, but I don't know if they ever got worked for other people because I used emulator. Yeah, could have just used tables instead of divs, bro. uh, so that is absolutely hilarious because my understanding of HTML tables is probably better than it should be because before we had CSS positioning and Flexbox and Grid and all these other things, right? All these other tools that we've got now at our disposal. Um, we use tables to produce layouts. And I would take like what the designer created, print it out on paper, and then get a marker that's going to show up well and a ruler, and I would start drawing lines to cut up the layout that the designer had put together so that I could create a table layout that would fit it. um, so yeah, still not using Tailwind, but I want to learn it. Tailwind's not bad. um, I wouldn't say I'm a Tailwind expert. I'm a late adopter, so there's still a whole bunch of stuff I need to learn about Tailwind, but I really like Tailwind. I was using Bootstrap Grid and Bootstrap Utilities, and then Tailwind showed up. Yeah, and like the thing that killed Bootstrap for me was I was still using Bootstrap even in the days of Flexbox. Um, but once Grid showed up, there was really no reason for me to use Tailwind um, because there was a native grid and I could get things to align to that grid. That's what really killed Tailwind for me. Um, you're not Tailwind, Bootstrap. Um, but yeah, let's go ahead and launch our Sudoku game. It should be here. Yeah. So one thing I want to do while I'm doing this is just make sure that we aren't throwing errors. I want to make sure everything's working. But here's some things that we're doing with CSS properties, right? So first of all of this highlighting that you see here, so the green row and the purple column, and then it's gray here, but it actually winds up being a different color. I'll give you guys the flashbang warning here, right? But if I turn off the dark reader, um, so this checkerboard pattern is done through CSS properties, but then this tomato color is Chow's choice. And then the green and the blue and the gold, those all those are all based on CSS properties, right? Um, and what we're doing is based on, where we're setting um, some pieces, we're setting some attributes in the grid, and based on the attributes of where we're set, we're using the cascade and the CSS variables to determine, what colors should be in this row versus what colors should be in this column versus, what colors should be in this region. And then the rest is just done through a normal checkerboard, right? Um, so um, it's very, very powerful, very, very powerful tool. And to do this with CSS classes would be a little bit more difficult, because these rows and these columns, we can easily just cascade the variable values down. Whereas if we weren't doing it that way, we would have to be changing CSS classes across the board, right? Um, so the CSS variables and then binding to CSS variables, we're going to use that, and I should say properties, right? CSS properties. We're going to be using that more, because I want to add a theme builder. Um, I don't want to have to use the dark reader, but if we use dark reader, I would like this grid to look a lot better. Um, right? We lost our checkerboard pattern, and there's some other stuff here, and like our buttons are bright white. Um, there's just some things that we could do better. But it looks like we aren't generating any errors, and I don't think we've broken anything at this point. Another thing that I really want to do, so when I hit this solve one cell, we're using wave function collapse, and we've discussed it a few times, and I'm happy to go into it if people are curious. Um, but I would like to visualize wave function collapse also. Um, and then there's another. So um, when I was younger, I played a lot of street hockey and ice hockey and stuff like that. Because of that, I've got some injuries to my foot. Um, that um, a lot of times the best thing I can do is ice it and put it up and wait for the swelling and stuff to go down. It's very painful, and but the good side to that is that I get to watch a whole bunch of YouTube, and I've been watching people do pathfinding algorithms. Um, and if you guys don't know, I grew up on a potato farm in Idaho, and um, I love like farming simulator and like I love virtual farming. I absolutely do not enjoy real farming. Um, there, there's a reason that I work in computer science and I'm not a farmer. Um, but um, I've been watching some people play the latest version of Farming Simulator 2025, and um, one of the things that's missing is like a pathfinding algorithm for fields. But I wanted to extend it, and um, I want to just do an experiment, where we could take like the shape of somebody's yard, um, and based on the shape of their yard, um, take the dimensions of like a lawnmower or something like that, and look at optimized paths for mowing a lawn. Um, so, implementing something like A star, but not true A star, because if you do true A star, the pathfinding algorithm for mowing a lawn is always a spiral, right? But that doesn't take into account the amount of time that it takes to turn and do things like that, right? So I'm curious if I can optimize an A star algorithm in such a way, that it recognizes that it can go over areas that it's already traversed, but has a penalty, right, to represent turning around or turning left or turning right. Um, so very curious about that. Um, so yeah, there's some things that I really want to take a look at, right? But I want to get this resource done for our Sudoku game. Um, and then once that's done, so if we look right now in this game, this has the lowest entropy and this has the lowest entropy. So it's going to be picking randomly between these, um, right? And it chose this row, um, and so now our lowest entropy is either, well, it's in this row, right? So it's never going to pick one of these regions. Um, but once it picks something in this region, it has to finish this region because our lowest entropy is here. Um, and now it's going to finish up this one, right? Um, and so now all of this has the same entropy. It's going to pick something randomly, which, then causes the entropy to change. And um, a lot of really cool stuff here, but we aren't here to look at the solver, right? We're here to take a look the um, or we're here to take a look at the resource that we started creating. One thing I do want to do. Wait, what happened here? Did I break? Did I break warp? Is warp broken? Let's try again. Okay. So, one thing I did want to do is NX build, right? We were using stats JSON, but I just want to see really quick if we build this, what our packages look like because we weren't able to do that at the end of the last stream. I promise not to get distracted in packages today. Um, SCSS plus Bootstrap for me, great combination. Also, when it comes to really custom websites with libraries like Material and PrimeMG, it's just hard to customize and often times not worth it because of losing update capabilities. That's a really good point. Um, that you know, pick your tooling to work with what you have. Don't pick your tooling because some guy on a stream somewhere said this is the way you should do it, right? Um, you guys understand your environment better, you understand your target audience better, you understand the capabilities of your devs better. Just because I'm here saying something, that's my opinion, right? Granted, my opinion is objectively better than any other opinion out there. Um, not really, but sometimes you just got to say stuff like that to throw people off. Um, but um, yeah, that's a very good point, Mathis. That um, definitely work with what you've got. Don't change and don't introduce hardship into your tool chains just because you want to work with a new shiny, right? Tailwind is great using flex, spacing, and spacing utilities, but not for theming because adding lots of classes to one component doesn't scale well. For example, if you need the same focus outline styles on all form elements, Bootstrap has a class form control, which targets, yeah. And that's where things like Daisy come into play, right? Because Daisy comes in and adds a whole bunch of that stuff for you, Mathis. Because like we can look at Tailwind as kind of like the low level framework, right, for CSS. Um, Something along the lines of React or Angular, right? But um, most people don't work with just vanilla Angular or vanilla React, right? We add in we add in libraries to help with styling. We add in libraries to help with components, right? Nobody's out there rewriting a calendar component every time they create a new Angular app. Well, that's not true. I've done it. Um, Partly because I'm cheap and partly because I just like showing people how we can do it on stream, right? Um, but for the majority of people out there, they're adding stuff to it. And that's kind of the way Tailwind is, right? You can work with Tailwind and it's a framework, but to make the framework work, you're going to have to do a whole bunch of stuff yourself. Or you could go grab something like Daisy UI or some other framework that works with Tailwind. Um, and they're going to have done a lot of that stuff to make the framework easier for you to use. Um, that's my take on like Tailwind, right? It's the framework that you can use to produce some amazing CSS stuff, right? And it does a lot of the stuff, like you said, spacing and things like that really well for you. Um, that being said, we're not using Tailwind at all here. This is pure vanilla CSS. This was the very first project that I ever started streaming, and we keep coming back to it because it's probably the most complicated project that I have. Um, but it's done entirely with vanilla CSS. Yeah, Daisy UI is my absolute favorite Tailwind library. And if you go take a look at any of my repos that aren't the Sudoku game, you're probably going to find Tailwind and Daisy in there. Um, anyway, our bundle sizes are looking good, right? This was over 300K when we started last week. Now we're down to 178. We could do more work here. There's a lot more that could be done. Um, one thing, so one thing that I really wanted to be able to do was create a resource that provided components. I don't think Angular's there yet. Um, I think there's some stuff in the works. And like Michael has been a longtime friend of the stream, and Michael shares a lot of stuff with me, and he shared some PRs um, into the Angular source code where they're exploring some stuff that will give us the ability to do components as resources. Once components as resources are a thing, the next thing to solve to really get these bundle sizes smaller is the providers array that happens on components. Because most services are very greedy when it comes to bundling. And what I mean by that is replacing that providers array. And there's an important reason to use the providers array. Um, it it allows the dependency injector to inject that same provider, from that level down. If we could solve how to do something lazy with the providers array, um, most of this stuff would move into our lazy chunks, and our initial total would mainly be the framework. Um, yeah, dynamics components and directives going to be much easier. Exactly. Way easier. And if you guys don't know, Michael is working with Rainer, um, and they're putting together a stream, and I think currently it's slated for the 25th. Is that right, Michael? So, not this week. It'll be a week from this Tuesday. Is that right? Would that be the 25th? Yeah, that would be. So a week from this Tuesday, Michael and Rainer will be putting together a stream on some very, very cool stuff. And I'm excited to see that stream. Oh, it's this Thursday. Oh, well, thank you for correcting me, Matt. So it is this week, this Thursday. Michael and Rainer. I for some reason I had the 25th in my head. That puts it on the 20th, right? Um, so this Thursday, I will be well, not participating, but I'll be there to watch Michael as he explains with Rainer this new idea. Um, very, very cool. He's got some very, very impressive ideas. and he shared some early source code with me. Can't wait for him to explain it. Got some very cool ideas. I think Rainer is really one of the leaders right now in thinking about how we talk about things like Signal Store. And Michael is right there with him. Um, and we're gonna have two of the giants of Signal Store talking about some incredible ideas with Signal Store, and I'm there for it. Um, 1 p.m. Central US. That's awesome. Exactly. Fake news. Fake news from fake news from Jason. That's all we can expect from this guy. Um, anyway, so our bundle sizes are looking good. Um, we could do more here. And this is where I think a lot of Angular projects fall down. Because I've worked in enterprise Angular projects where this total right here is like 10 megabytes. And just think about that, right? Like, don't look at the transfer size. The transfer size is important to see like over the wire costs, right? But the real number we should be looking at is this raw size. And the reason I say that is that this gets transferred over the wire, but once it reaches the browser, the gzip turns it back into this size. These are the bytes that when your browser gets it, it has to stop, it has to parse it, it has to, re-render anything that this may have changed. Um, and then, continue forward from there. So these bytes are the ones that I contend matter the most versus these bytes. And the more bytes that we can move into lazy chunks, um, the better we are, because lazy chunks, are on demand, right? So this 27 K, the only time it's rendered is when we ask for it, right? And that's going to slow down the initial render of when we ask for it. But every render after that, we've already got that chunk, right? And it's already been processed. Um, so yeah, um, cheese it by, but realized it was actually Friday after. Oh, Michael's the one giving us fake news. 1 p.m. Central. Oh no, Michael. Oh, I may be late or miss a good portion. Oh, I may miss most of it. I may have to leave early. I may have to leave early. Friday, I've got an interview panel that I'm excited about for a company. If you guys don't know, I'm still looking for a job. Um, Friday, I've got an interview panel set up. Um, it's a bummer, Michael. And it's during that time. Instead of gzip bytes, we do gzip bytes. Exactly. Gzip bytes always taste better than gzip bytes. Anyway, let's get back into our code. Let's go ahead and fire up WebStorm. Um, I'm so tempted to try 2025.1 because Jan posted on Twitter that a lot of the new stuff with templates and stuff is fixed with 2025.1. Um, but um, there were a bunch of times. Um, why does it think like I deleted no modules.old? That must be something cached, right? Like if we go back here and we do an ls, um, so we've got apps coverage dips. Oh, we do have node modules.old. What is in ls node modules.old? And there's still a bunch of stuff in here. That's so weird. I thought I deleted it. I'll clean it up after. So it wasn't cached like I thought. But this is the this is what we're talking about with like this grid store brings a whole bunch of stuff into the bundle that we don't need there. We could have the grid store be lazily loaded, but because we need it in the DI chain at this point, um, there's just no good way to not make this greedily bundled, right? Like the fact that we import it here and then reference it here, it has to be greedily bundled. And so that's going to change our initial bytes. So, I mean, there are ways around this, but I don't know. It really comes down to where you want to spend your time. Do you want to spend your time worrying about the bundle sizes? Maybe, right? It really depends on what your user experience is. Yeah, there's a bunch we could do here. Still. Anyway, let's take a look at our grid resource and our grid resource feature. So our feature brings in the grid resource. We've got grid commands. Um, and our grid commands are what drive a lot of stuff. So if we look at our current grid, we look at some of our features, right? Um, look at our with grid here. Um, a lot of these things had these on and knits on them, and with grid doesn't. But I know with grid errors does. So if we take a look here, we've got this hook and we've got this on and knit hook. And we're relying on this last cell updated. Um, and this is basically the way that we're creating an event. So this last cell updated is this is a subject that we're passing in to our feature. And our feature is watching this subject. And the way we're doing that is we're using an RX method. Um, so this grid errors watch cell value changes, and this is one thing to be aware of with like signal store. Um, this originally used to just be watch cell value changes, but we had to namespace it with grid errors on the front of it. And the reason for that is we were getting collisions. So even if you're using the private, right, like this underscore in anything in the signal store makes this private to the signal store, um, you'll still get name collisions. And so we were using watch cell changes in a lot of different places. We had to namespace them all so they didn't collide. Um, but anyway, we're watching this subject, and this subject basically becomes our event stream. So when the subject emits, then we run through and we check for grid errors and stuff like that, right? We don't have to do that um, with our grid resource because our grid resource has these commands, right? So instead of right, we can set the grid values, we can update a cell. There might be some other grid commands that we set, right? Like set the currently focused cell or things like that. Um, but because we have these grid values, um, we don't necessarily need this last cell updated. Um, so we'll be cleaning that up a bit too. Um, so like our set cell value, I believe this is the last thing we brought over was our set cell value. Oh, and we have issues with grid computed. I remember that. Um, just trying to remind myself of where we were. So here we're calling this update grid cell command. Um, and this command basically just creates a command that's the update cell type, right? Um, and we pass in the props that we need on it. Um, and then instead of having to, so this last cell updated is called on the grid in a couple of different places, right? Um, so if we take a look at our grid again, so our grid feature here, um, we've got this last cell updated prop, and inside of here, if we take a look at everywhere where we're using it, um, let's look at our grid store here. So with puzzle mode, with pencil marks, it should be in with grid, right? So we've got our state, we've got our props, methods, cell updated. Yeah, I guess it's just not highlighting it because it can't figure out where it is. But notice here, like we call this cell updated um, method in a bunch of places. And really, the only reason it exists is to emit values on this handler, which we're not going to need. Um, so anytime a cell is updated, we actually call this handler with with our resource and with our commands that we're using from our resource. Um, these commands actually become the events that we're using, right? And so here um, we set the update grid cell command, um, which updates the cell, but because we know we're changing that cell value, we can also call the cell updated. Um, and that doesn't work. Um, where is my cell updated? Okay, so I think we still need to do this because we have some features that rely on this resource, right? So like the pencil marks rely on on this event happening, but our loop becomes simpler, um, and we can fix our pencil marks to be better that way too. Um, you know what? I'm not sure if I have any mods here today, but um, I can't mod you, Michael. Um, just a second. Um, somebody won themselves a ban. Like, I don't care how cheap your viewers are. Nobody who doesn't use Angular or who isn't interested in programming is going to purchase. Like they're not going to come to my stream. Me purchasing viewers is probably like one of the dumbest decisions I could make. Um, so that and it's kind of annoying to have people come to the stream and just be like, "Hey, 5 viewers, whatever, dude." Um, anyway, um, so we've got our set cell value. What I'm curious about is I don't remember where we were. Um, so let's replace in our grid store, instead of oh, no, we can't do that yet. We can't do that yet because grid computed doesn't work yet, right? So with grid computed doesn't work. Um, and the reason it doesn't work, oh, no, it doesn't. Yeah. Um, the reason grid computed doesn't work yet is let's pull up our grid computed resource. And grid computed expects there to be a grid state, um, and we're not using grid state. Um, so if we look at our initial state, we're omitting grid from grid state. And these grid computed values come from um, the the grid on the grid state. Um, and the reason we aren't using um, the grid is that the grid comes from the resource, right? So the resource is what is maintaining our grid for us. And this is where we keep going back and forth, right? Because um, sometimes we have the grid, sometimes we don't, and it just. But we need to keep the grid here because we we need it needs to be able to change, right? Um, and so the current grid either comes in or we create a grid state. This grid equals set grid values, right? So once we return the resource, it becomes this grid. Um, but for our computed to work, right? For our grid computed to work, there needs to be um, it it needs to have a grid property on it. And so the question is, when we do this, like these grid computed, we've got the next to focus, we've got the selected, and these can both work. Let's change. This is gonna break stuff because our initial state is the grid state, but we're just omitting the grid. So by me doing this, right, we could do omit grid state um, grid, right? And now if we go back here, our computed works, right? Um, but it's our rotated grid that's broken, and it's our rows, columns, and regions that are broken. Um, and really, the only places we're using the grid is in the rotated grid or the state grid. So we could probably fix this up. Hey, I was just asking about a mod, and guess what? I want to be a developer shows up. Thank you, man. Um, thanks for showing up. It's good to have you here. Um, looks like customers don't appreciate front end. Um, and thank you guys for wishing me luck. So I think every front end dev should learn a little bit of back end at the very least. And every back end dev should learn a little bit of front end at the very least, right? Um, and it comes down to like the T-shaped skills that a lot of organizations will talk about, right? Like You should have a breadth of knowledge, but you should be able to go very deep in certain areas, right? And that's where the T comes from, right? Like you got breadth across various knowledge, but your front end knowledge is way better than any of your other knowledge, right? Um, you're talking a little bit about a Twitter conversation that I had this week, and um, we were talking about how front end devs look at back end devs and like, oh, it's so easy to be a back end dev, right? And back end devs look at front end devs and like, oh, it's so easy to be a front end dev. The reality is, development is development, and every part has their pieces that are easy, and every type of development has their pieces that are difficult, right? The problem that most people when they specialize is they like when a front end dev does their job very well, the front end looks beautiful. And if a back end dev has to come in and make changes because the front end dev has done their job well and the code is well structured and well laid out, that back end dev who has to go in and make changes, those changes are relatively easy for them to make because the code is easy to understand, the abstractions are there, right? And things are simple. It's the same thing with backend devs going in and making changes to APIs, right? If a backend dev has done their job well, then when a front end dev consumes the APIs are easy for a front end dev to consume. But even more than that, if say a front end dev has to jump in and make a change to a back end API for whatever reason, those back end APIs seem very, very simple because the back end dev has done their job, is properly structured, their commands and their services and all of that stuff, so that the front end dev understands the code fairly intuitively. Um, and those changes seem simple, right? What we're missing in both of those stories is the backend dev has spent a ton of time worrying about concurrency, worrying about their resource pools, worrying about you know how do we scale this, right? When it jumps across servers, how do we scale it? Um, all sorts of things like that that the front end dev doesn't really even think about, right? Um, but they've done that well in such a way that a front end dev can jump in and make a quick change to an API, maybe add a property or who knows what, and it seems really, really easy, right? It's the same thing with the front end dev, right? When the back end dev jumps into the front end dev, um, the front end dev's done their job and all the CSS classes are there and uh, all of the pieces related to inputs are there and all of the bindings are there and all of the stores are there. So the backend dev, when they come in and maybe they need to add a field to a form for whatever reason, they just throw a field on there. They add a couple of CSS classes. They add it to the state and everything magically works, right? But what the backend dev isn't seeing is all the architecture and work that the front end dev has done to make that possible. Um, so those are the two interesting places where front end and back end tend to look at each other and go like, oh, it's so easy to do that, right? um, I think you should learn to do some back end. um, yeah, you will see a lot more jobs for back end or full stack. The Like full stack is basically it's a company trying to get two developers for the price of one, right? Because technically I'm a full stack developer, but I will tell you I am way better at front end than I am at back end, right? Um, that wasn't always the case. For a lot of my career, I was way better at back end development, or even at some points in my career, I was way better at like GUI Windows development, right? Or iOS development or things like that, right? Your skill sets morph and change based on what your day to day looks like. And that's the sign that I look for of a truly good developer, right? Um, is can that developer step into a new environment and be productive? Not immediately, right? I don't expect immediate productivity out of anybody. That's just unrealistic. But how long does it take a developer? Like I think any developer can be productive front end or back end. Um, it just takes time. Um, and what I look for is the curiosity and the flexibility to shorten that time. Um, so truly great devs will be able to step into any environment um, and understand that environment fairly quickly and be productive in that environment, more rapidly than other developers. So I'm doing good, man. And you gotta love. I want to be a developer. Um, Out here spitting facts, right? Um, Both front end and back end devs are bad. He's the only good dev out here. I'm gonna have to agree with that one. Sorry guys. I'm lumping myself into the bad category there too. Um, I'm planning to go full stack as well. React and Java soon. I'll see what happens. And yeah, pick the tools that make the most sense to you. Um, like I have um I've worked in Java. Java is probably one of my least favorite languages to work in. But it's also probably one of the most popular languages out there for the back end, right? So learning Java is very, very useful. Um, so what kind of programmer am I in my day to day? Looks like a house of cards burning. That I think that's the reality. Like I was talking to my daughter the other day, right? Um, and she's getting to that age where she's getting more and more responsibility. And I made the statement to her that when I was her age, I thought all I need to do is get moved out of the house, um, get married, and life gets easier, right? I was so naive and stupid. That's the way I'm gonna put it. Um, the interesting thing is very rarely does life ever get easier. Most of the time, the challenges change, and the discussion we were having came down to she next year's her senior year in high school, um, and um, we're trying to encourage her to take classes that will give her college credit. And to her credit, she is very, very receptive to this discussion and things like that. But um, you know, the reason the discussion came up is, I'm telling her, you're at the point in your life where the decisions you make don't just affect you in the next month, the next 6 months, the next year. The decisions you make now have potential lifelong consequences, right? And as you grow up and as you get older and as you gain more and more responsibility, the number of decisions that have lifelong consequences continue to grow. The reason I'm bringing that up is it's the same thing with like developers, right? And engineers, right? As a junior engineer, the number of consequences the number of decisions you can make that have lifelong consequences are very next to nothing, right? Um, well, they should be next to nothing. Most organizations don't work that way, right? Um, as you become senior, the number of decisions that you make that have lifelong consequences for that software that you're working on grow and grow and grow, right? And as you get higher and higher up in the org, right, as you start reaching like, architect or staff, the number of decisions that you make that have lifelong consequences are almost every decision you make, right? And so eh, you know, again, I thought I would reach a point in my career where, oh, it'll just be easy. At this point, everybody will listen to me and things will be easy. Well, last year proved that that's not the case, right? And it, like the decisions you make change, and the impact and scope of those decisions continues to grow. Um, I think most developers feel like you, that we're a flaming stack of cards, right? We're a flaming house of cards, and we're just one sharp gust away from becoming a full outright, blaze of, burning mess, or, if the gust is too strong, we get blown over. Um, and I think that that's the way, most, and maybe I'm projecting here, but I think that's the way most things are in life, right? Like a lot of times, the face that we put on versus how we actually feel about where we are entirely different. And yeah, um, I don't know. That I make way more mistakes than people probably think I do, and that's perfectly fine, right? Um, anyway, we need a way to get at our grid state, so our resource needs to provide that. I've been thinking today about tech stacks and stuff, and honestly, what I honestly think that it probably doesn't matter what tech stack I choose, but it matters is how I use it and how I market my abilities. I can't just go on LinkedIn and span my resume around. Things are so bad these days. That is very insightful. I want to be a developer. When you're first starting out, the language and tech stack you use matters. Um, And what do I mean by that? Well, if you go out and the first language you pick is Fortran, um, it's going to be way more difficult for you to discover learning resources than if you pick something like Python today, or Java, or .NET, or JavaScript, right? Like the big languages, right? C, C++. Those languages, there's a lot of resources out there to learn them. There's a reason that Fortran developers get paid a lot. There's not a lot of them, and there are not a lot of people that understand Fortran. Worse, like at one point in my career, I worked on InterSystems Cache. You would not believe the number of recruiters that reach out to me. They're like, "Hey, I saw InterSystems Cache on your resume. Would you like to come work and do InterSystems Cache?" Well, first of all, no, I don't enjoy InterSystems Cache. Um, it, right? But for the right price, I might do it for a little while. Um, but second off, the very next question when I say, "Yeah, we're probably not a good fit," the very next question out of their mouth is, do you know anybody who I can talk to, right? There aren't a lot of InterSystems Cache developers out there. There aren't a lot of resources outside of InterSystems for Cache. Um, and it's a reality. And so as as a somebody who's learning, pick a language with a lot of resources out there, right? JavaScript's a good language to pick up because it's very forgiving. And you can write it object oriented, you can write it functional, you can write it procedural, right? So it's a really good language to pick up. It doesn't have a lot of the rigidity of something, say, like Java, where you've got to have the main class and things, right? You've got to understand classes and objects and things like that, just to get up off the ground. Um, Python is another good language, right? Where, especially if you want to go into AI, there's a lot of resources. It's a good learning language. Um, so yeah, um, so I need to find ways to distinguish myself, which might not be related to a tech stack. And that is another insightful point to make. A lot of times, the things that would distinguish me from other developers was not my tech skills, but my communication skills, right? Or other skills like that. Um, you know, I've often had people who, they're just like, you don't write like a programmer. You make things easy to understand, and that's valuable, right? Java is garbage, man. I saw some code, and it is honestly so bad and convoluted. Exactly, right? Um, any language can be written that way. Java can be beautiful. I would die IRL if I had to write Java. Like I've seen beautiful Java code. I've worked like when I worked for KSL Cars, our backend was in Java. Um, right? We did NetBeans, and I've learned a bunch of the Java like struts and different frameworks. Like that's how old my Java skills are. As I was using struts back in the day. But here's the annoying thing. Um, Before I came to work for KSL Cars, they had a developer. This developer was one of those developers that hates frameworks, but still uses them, but customizes the frameworks to work the way they want to. So we were on struts, but it was this person's version of struts. So if we ever wanted to upgrade, we had to go in and make changes so that our code would work. It was horrible. Don't ever do that. I've seen people do that to like Angular. They'll grab the Angular source code, like, oh, Angular sucks when it does this, right? Don't do that. You're not going to be with a company forever. All you're doing is you're putting hidden time bombs in the code. Um, and if you're one of those developers that's doing that, man, stop, please. Just for the good of the rest of us who don't do that, don't do that, please. But anyway, yeah. Um, Polymorphism. What is that? Is that a type of frog? Um, Polymorphism is very, very powerful. But most languages can't do it right, and most people don't understand it. And um, like polymorphic code is amazing, um, but most programming languages don't even do polymorph. Like Java can't do true polymorphism, um, and like true polymorphic code could inherit from more than like even JavaScript doesn't do true polymorphism, right? So when we write a class in Java, or Java, JavaScript, C Sharp, there's a lot of classes or a lot of languages out there that can't do true polymorphism. True polymorphic code would be able to inherit from multiple parents. Um, Turns out that that's extremely difficult to do. Um, and so most languages don't do true polymorphism, right? Um, we take some concepts of polymorphism, right? And we sprinkle it into our code and we say, oh yeah, this is polymorphic code. Well, it kind of is, right? But it's not true polymorphism. Um, so we usually have the ability in most modern languages to inherit from one parent, but then to implement either interfaces or implement some other interface to our code that makes it appear polymorphic, but it's not truly polymorphic. If that makes sense. And we're getting down into semantics here when we're arguing against polymorphism. I got to work on my communication skills. I love OOP. I love when dog extends animal. Right. OOP. Man, you guys have got me off on tangents today. We haven't written a lot of code, but that's okay. Um, right. Today we're chasing squirrels. Um, OOP is an amazing tool. Um, but the the premier book on OOP for a long time has been this book, right? Design Patterns. Um, This is one of my absolute favorite books. This is the book that I attribute that took me from being a junior developer, pretending to be a senior, to being an actual senior, and moving into like staff and architectural type thinking. Um, this book changed the way I think about code. Um, Very, very good code. But even this book, in the introduction, says, let's see if I can find it for you guys. Um, I'm looking for. It's somewhere in one of the prefaces, but they talk about um, favoring composition over. I don't remember where it is. I was gonna show it to you. I don't want to waste a bunch of time reading through like the preface and stuff, but one of the key concepts that this book taught me um, with regards to OOP is a powerful pattern, um, object-oriented programming, right? But even the book, right, that most people attribute with writing the book on object-oriented programming says to favor composition over inheritance. Um, and what does that mean? Um, right? We should be composing our objects instead of inheriting our objects. I mean, there's a bunch of reasons for that. So first of all, welcome to my TED Talk. We're gonna have code up in the background, but we're gonna ignore it. Uh, but anyway, um, favoring composition over inheritance, there's a bunch of reasons for that. And one of the first reasons comes down to, when dog extends animal, right? Um, you might think that that's a good idea, right? And so you start off with an animal class, right? And animal classes have a way to move, so you add a move method, right? And animal classes have, a way to eat, so you have an eat method or, consume method or whatever, right? And then animal classes have, um, I don't know, right? Like you set up a really good base animal class, right? And then you're like, you know what? Let's follow, right? We've got our animalia. Now let's follow our phylums. So, right, we set up birds, right? And birds can fly. And birds, and birds tweet and birds have feathers and all of this stuff, right? Then we set up our reptiles, and reptiles are cold-blooded, and reptiles walk, and reptiles, reptiles are reptiles, right? Then you have your fish class, and fish swim, and fish do all of this other stuff. And then you have your mammal class, right? And mammals have fur, and mammals, give birth, like live birth to their kids and to their children and all of that, right? Oh, and that's the other thing, right? Like birds lay eggs, reptiles lay eggs, fish lay eggs, mammals give live birth, right? Um, and then you encounter something stupid like a platypus, right? Because now a platypus swims, a platypus has fur, a platypus has scales, a platypus lays eggs, but a platypus is a mammal, right? And so how do you inherit from mammal? And this is where things like polymorphism come into play, where you want your platypus to inherit from mammal, but you want your platypus to inherit from an egg layer, and right, and suddenly your whole object scheme is messed up, right? And this is a very easy one for people to follow, but if anybody's worked in any sort of object-oriented code base, you've seen this before, where you've got this beautiful object inheritance set up in the very, very beginning, and then one class comes along and just destroys everything because it has to change all the assumptions you've made. Um, what version of Angular? We're on 19.2. It's insane. Um, OOP sounds good, but when you actually have to write code using it, it becomes not good. Man, it really doesn't make me want to write Java. So here's the thing, right? OOP is a very powerful tool when it comes to encapsulation, right? OOP understands encapsulation very, very well, right? Because objects have public pieces that are the pieces that you're intended to work with, right? But they encapsulate away everything else that you don't really need to care about, right? Like the classic example of most OOP books is a car, right? Um, when most people get into a car or a vehicle of some sort, they understand that you have the accelerator, you have the ability to move, shift the car into a state that is going to move forward, and you have the ability to shift the car into a state that's going to move in reverse. You have the steering wheel, you have your indicators. You're going to have like windshield wipers, you're going to have mirrors, things like that, right? Like when you get into a car, you understand the interface that's around you, right? There will be optional interfaces like, maybe you've got a GPS or things like that, but those are optional and they're added on later, right? There's a whole bunch of things you don't have to worry about with the car, right? Like you don't have to worry about the fuel air mixtures. You don't have to worry about your cylinder timings. You don't have to worry about how the cooling is working. You don't have to worry about, your air intake. You don't have to worry about batteries and all of that stuff, right? Like all of that stuff is encapsulated away from the interface that you have with the vehicle, right? And that's kind of good OO design, right? With good OO design, you only expose what your consumers need and everything else you encapsulate away. And that's the power of OO. And it's an amazing paradigm when used properly. The problem is that you run into these classic object-oriented conundrums, right? Um, the the classic one being, the platypus example. Another classic object-oriented example is the strongest form of coupling that exists in any kind of programming is the inheritance model, right? Um, your base class, if your base class changes in any way um, that forces the child class to change, then every child class has to change, right? And that's where OO becomes very inflexible because at some point you may have to make a breaking change to a base class, but now you've got thousands of classes that now need to be updated, right? It's hideous, right? So inheritance can be a breaking point that forces your code down a path that you don't, right, because you don't want to make thousands of changes because you don't want to break that inflexible inheritance bond. Um, and that's one of the classic things, right? So we've got the platypus example, um, we've got the inflexibility of inheritance, and then the last classic example comes down to a famous quote, right? Where in object-oriented programming, I asked for a banana, but I got the gorilla holding on to the banana and the entire jungle, right? And that's the other piece of inheritance that comes along, right? Like banana may extend something that forces you to have to pass along the gorilla that might be grabbing the banana, right? But along with that, the gorilla only exists because the jungle exists. So now you have to bring along the jungle, right? And that's the other piece of kind of that inflexible inheritance chain, is that sometimes when you want to ask for something simple, based on your object graph, you may have to pull in most of your project, which you don't want to do. That's why with OO, they say, favor composition over inheritance. Once you bring in that inheritance, you start to bring in problems like the platypus problem. You start to bring in problems like, um, the gorilla banana example, and you start to bring in, that inflexibility of the inheritance chain. Um, right? Like you can solve the platypus problem with things like decorators, right? Um, so maybe you have the animal class, but a platypus is just a specialized class of animal that has decorators on it for egg layer, fur, swims, walks, has a beak, right? Is venomous, things like that. So those decorators, right? And Angular does this, right? So in Angular, we have classes. We call them component classes, right? But what makes those component classes work? Well, it's the decorator that gives it the selector and things like that, right? So we're taking a JavaScript class and instead of it extending it through inheritance, which is inherently um, can lead to difficult positions, they chose to use the decorator pattern, and so now we decorate our classes, right? Um, with like our with like Signal Store, they went with a more um, functional composition, right? So we're looking at it right now, right? We've got the grid resource. That grid resource includes props, right? So we've got with props, um, and then we've got our computed, right? And then we've got right. So these functions allow us to build up a bigger functional piece, and this bigger functional piece in turn allows us to build up like our signal store feature, which in turn allows us to build up a bigger signal store, and that signal store then returns a decorated service that we can inject, like we would a normal service. This is functional composition, right? Versus something like decorator composition. And they're in that book, right? Design patterns. They go over various forms of composition that work well with object-oriented approaches. Um, and so that's kind of you know there's nothing wrong with object-oriented programming, but it's a tool, right? And it needs to be used correctly. Um, you know, you can use a hammer to cut drywall, right? But your cuts are going to be hideous and ugly. Why not use like a tool that's designed to cut drywall, right? You can use a hammer to cut down a tree, right? Um, Depending on the type of hammer, your experience may be better or worse, right? Some hammers include like a little hatchet on the back of them. Other ones might have like a claw. Other ones might be a mallet that doesn't have, right? And so um, pick the tool that works for what you're trying to do, and pick the tool that works well for what you're trying to do, and you'll do better, right? It's it's the same thing with any with any profession. I grew up on a farm. You would never pull a planter with a pickup truck, right? It just doesn't make sense. A pickup truck doesn't have the proper abilities. It doesn't have enough power. Um, there's just a whole bunch of reasons why you would never try to plant a field with a pickup truck. Um, on the same token, you would never try to transport things long distances with a tractor, right? It has the power to pull a whole bunch, um, but it just can't go fast enough to really make it profitable. Um, the same thing with software, right? Properly designed object-oriented code serves its place where encapsulation is very important. Properly designed functional code serves its place where a mutation and things like that need to be taken out of the equation, right? And properly written procedural code is just really, really easy to write. Um, and quite often, a lot of problems can be solved procedurally, right? Um, so pick the tool that works for what you're trying to do, and just use it. Um, anyway, let's get back into this, right? Let's fix up our grid resource. Man, got about a half hour before I need to end. We're gonna go at the beginning of the stream. My daughter did really well with dance last night. We're gonna go celebrate as a family. So looking forward to that. But I need to end on time so I can go get showered and get ready to go hang out. Yeah. When does the coding stream start? Dude, you're a freaking mod. You've been around long enough to know that we never code on this stream, right? Um, all it takes is one properly asked question and we get distracted. Um, anyway, the the problem with our grid computed feature, I'm not sure why it's not showing. Oh, no, I'm not sure why the errors aren't showing up when I'm not looking at the right file. Um, the problem is we don't have a grid, right? And to create a rotated grid, we need the grid. Um, so let's add a grid here, right? Oh, we've got our grid. Um, all we need to do is go into here, um, and on our type, um, we can add. I think we can just add our props, right? I don't think they've done computed anymore, but we can just do grid. Um, so for our props, we can do grid, and grid is um, Of course, it's a computed cell state that. I think we can just do computed cell state. Boom, boom. I think we can bring this in. No. It's a signal cell state. That one we can bring in. Um, from Angular Core. So there we go. So now our grid comes in as a signal. And it's important to note that this is not a writable signal because it's not yet. Um, we may turn this into a linked signal. Because if we turn our grid into a linked signal, when that changes, a lot of other things can change. Um, so that fixes up our computed here in our region, no, our rotated grid, right? Um, which is just computed. And then these are computed based on that computed. So if we were to make grid a linked signal, that signal would change whenever we changed it. We could think about that in the resource. Um, but because our grid is computed and our rotated grid is computed and our regions are computed, we we get the benefit of when that grid changes, everything updates. So we're in a good place. This breaks our stuff right now. Let's go into our grid store. And instead of grid, we're going to go with grid computed now. Um, or not with grid computed, we're going to go with grid resource. And bring that in. And that's going to break a whole bunch of other things. Um, so because with grid resource returns a grid, like with grid errors is going to have a problem. Because with grid errors expects a grid state. Um, so let's export this type here. Export type, and we're going to call this grid resource feature. We're going to call this grid resource state, and this is just going to be omit omit this. So now we can change this to be grid resource state. And then in our grid computed, we can also come up here and make this grid resource state. Grid resource state. And the reason we're doing this is that we don't want to keep doing this over and over again, right? So here we can just change this to be grid resource state. We need to import that. But because we did that, we've got this grid here, right? Again, we're using grid. So we need to fix this up. So on our props, we also just need to add our grid. That is that's wrong, dude. This just needs to be a signal. Signal cell state. There we go. So there we go. That fixes up most of it, but we've got one issue here. What is this issue? Oh, we're trying to patch the state on the grid, and we can't do that anymore. Um, However, on our grid resource feature, what are we trying to patch the grid for? We're trying to patch the grid because we are modifying the entire grid. In our grid resource, hmm, we need we need a way to set the error on a specific piece of grid. Hmm. So if we take a look at our grid resource, we've got this update cell value. We could set cell value, but it's got just a value. I think what we need to do is we need to add a new command. Um, our grid resource. And we'll just call this one set cell error. Um, and I want to keep it following this same pattern, right? So it's trying to flip flop, put the cell state first and the value second. Um, but notice here we're setting the values, and then here we're setting the new value. Um, if we flip flop this, basically what this means is our API becomes more difficult for people to use. Um, and the reason it becomes more difficult for people to use is that so far the value comes first and then the cell state comes second. As soon as we flip flop that, now people have to remember that for cell value, cell state comes first, but for cell error, the has error comes, the cell state comes first, right? Um, your IDE is going to help with that, but that's some extra context that people shouldn't have to keep in their head. So we're just going to say has error, and we're just going to set that Boolean, and we're going to take our cell state, and our cell state goes here, right? Um, And I the changed grid has error. what I'm what I'm trying to think about is with this, we went through the entire grid and we were able to change the entire grid. And then once the grid was changed, we just put the grid into the state. Um, I'm concerned about performance here. I'm going to call that right off the bat. Um, but um, let's measure performance first, right? And then um, so what we want to do is we just want to say, ooh, I don't like this. Um, like it's being careful here, but really we could just say, hey, not has error. Oh, never mind. No, no. Is value required on update cell value? The value is required row column. We also need a has error equals false here. Value is optional. But if I don't pass a value, I don't like this. Um, so instead of doing that, the other thing that we were just talking about is my grid commands being a signal. This is probably not right, and it's leading to some issues with the grid resource. But so update cell is updating the grid. Value is read only. We call update grid here, which just changes the grid. I think we can just do the update cell. Yeah, I'm trying to think my way through this. Um, if we look at update cell, we get the props from it. And the props come the column. So we can also pass in has error, which is a Boolean, right? Um, and that is going to break some stuff here, but that's okay. So cell updated. Um, well, so update cell value, we call cell updated after every update cell value. I don't think we want that. I think what we want here is we can set the cell value. And instead of doing this, um, row column value is read only, has error, right? Update grid cell command. So we need to go modify this. And here we can set our has error equals false. And add in our has error. That fixes that. So our grid resource is now fixed. But we're not getting our row column value in is read only. So we can pull those out of our cell state. The row column value is read only equals cell state. Cool. And the reason we did it this way versus using the update cell value is if we use update cell value, we're going to get extra calls to cell updated, and cell updated is what's going to cause us to check the grid for errors. Hey, I missed you saying that you were leaving, but it was good to have you here. I want to be a developer. Um, but we want to avoid when we set the error, checking for errors again, right? So there's some stuff to think through here, and we'll have to come back to it. But for right now, we can set the error on our stuff. And now in our grid error feature here, instead of patching the grid, well, there's one last thing to do. So our set cell error, we'll come back to that. The has error feature, right? Because we don't want to keep changing whether the grid has errors. It doesn't really matter. Because we're using signals, changing a lot isn't the same as changing a lot with it isn't the same as changing a lot with state dot error has error. So we can just pass in our has error here. So with signals, changing a lot isn't the same as changing a lot with RxJS, like a subject or a behavior subject. I mean, the reason for that is Um, Updates get basically coalesced in a signal, right? And so you can make a bunch of updates to a signal, and those updates won't be propagated until the next change detection cycle, is a way to think about it. Um, and so um, we can change has error to false like 10 times in a row, and it doesn't have really that many negative implications versus if this was a subject. Um, I do think at some point we need to come back and revisit the commands. The commands probably shouldn't be a subject. They should probably be a subject. Or they shouldn't be a signal. They should be a subject. They shouldn't be a subject. They should be a subject. No, they shouldn't be a signal. They should be a subject. Um, so one thing we can do is we no longer need to worry about the changed grid here. So we can take that out. Um, and instead of draft.length, we can just grab grid, right? And here we can say grid. And here we can say, we're not going to be modifying this and we're not going to be setting this. Instead, what we can do is right here, we can say that we want to go state dot, and here we want to um, what has error? What do we call this? Our resource set cell error. Oh, we need to also come up here and say, hey, on our methods, we no longer call this method. Oh, we can also make set cell error internal. Let's do that. Let's grab this here, and on our grid error feature, instead of this, we'll put that in place. So there we go. Now we've got our set cell error. And so now we can call, hey, state.set cell error. And we no longer need to invert this because we want to set it to be that, oh, but it could be undefined. So because it's a sparse array, the errors array is a sparse array. So that could be undefined. So we're just going to coerce it to be true or false. And then grid row column, and that gives us a cell state. Yep. So grid row and column. We'll grab an exact cell state, which means we no longer need these, and we no longer need this. So it looks like we're setting the has errors to false. And then we're analyzing the errors right away. So I guess we need to put that has errors back. So we'll grab this and nope. We're definitely not going to undo it that way. We'll just go back to the grid resource and update has grid error. We'll just put this one back in. And we're going to add a void on this one also. So there we go. And there are ways we could automate this. I've been thinking about doing that, but as I've worked more and more with Signal State, hey, Keikan Sami, it's been a long time, man. Welcome to the stream. Thanks for showing up. It has been a very long time. Um, right at the end of the stream, though. But thank you for joining. Anyway, we fixed up our width, our grid errors feature. And so now it works with our resource. Um, a lot of this stuff I actually think we can turn into resources also. Um, well, they're using the resource, right? So our grid resource is what's providing our grid for us. Um, and it's also providing the interface. So the resource itself is just providing the grid. Um, and we've got loads that we use with oh, that's why we're using a signal, because we used this just a resource instead of an RX resource. I think this should be an RX resource. We'll come back to that next stream, and discuss why this should be an RX resource versus the resource that we've got now. But our grid resource gives us an API, right, where we can set grid values or we can update a specific cell. Um, and this is allowing us to change the grid. Uh, and then our resource just always returns a grid, right? Um, and so when we create this grid resource, we get this grid that has an API that we can work with, right? We could set values and update values or set the, set the grid itself. RFC part one, I actually really like the resource. I there I think the resource is the right way to go. And the cool thing about resources is resources don't have to be HTTP resources, right? And when I'm talking resources, like they don't have to be GraphQL. They don't have to be post or I mean get, right? They don't have to be get commands. They don't have to be um like what most people think of resources right now tend to wrap just HTTP resources. But there are so many different uses we can have for resources. I've been thinking about some games and stuff. Like the the canvas, right, could be a resource. The player character could be a resource. Um, the I don't know, there's just so many things that could be resources. And so like enemies could be resources, right? Like, um, and basically what happens is um, you can create these resources and then return them. You could use services to provide them, or you could just create them yourselves. Who cares how you do it, right? Um, but I think resource is the right way to go with Angular because resources in programming are just things that you can work with, right? That provide some form of state. Um, I actually think that the resources themselves are going to change the way we think about things like signal features and um, like signal store and things like that, where state is going to move more out of the the store itself and into the resources. And then what we'll have is services that provide nice interfaces that wrap up our resources. So like we're doing a functional resource here, right? Where we create the resource, we ask for the current grid. There's a map of commands that we pass in, right? And then based on those commands, we can do different things. But our loader basically becomes our API for our resource. So by passing new commands into our loader, we get um, powerful ways to interact with our um, with our resource, right? I don't know. I'm rambling a bit because I wasn't prepared for the question, but all in all, I think the resource is going to be amazing. I think the HTTP resource is the Angular team showing us, hey, you can take the resource primitive that we have and you can extend it to create a more powerful resource, right? Um, where was I? Where? Oh, I can't tell. I can't tell this story because I'm under NDA. I can't tell the story um, because the GDE stuff needs to be a safe place. Um, but what I can tell you is the outcome of the story, and the outcome is that the hope is that for most modern Angular going forward, HTTP resource replaces HTTP client. Um, once the RFC is done and once the resource is stabilized. So going forward, I'm going to be using the HTTP resource on stream, just so that everybody can see how it's used and get used to it. And there will be, once it's stabilized, like there's one thing about being a streamer, right? Um, I control, I'm my own PM. I have my own deliverables. I have all of that stuff, right? So I control a whole bunch. And so I can do silly things like use resource before resource is finalized. Um, but the benefit to that is that once it's finalized, I also have example code available for you guys. Um, yeah. So post is different. And it's such a it's we're kind of in the wild west of Angular again. Um, and what do I mean by that? People make statements about what we should or shouldn't do, but we don't know totally, right? So like the statement we shouldn't do post commands with HTTP resource um, is a good statement, and I agree with that statement, but we don't have a replacement for it, right? And so um, I guess the better thing to say is HTTP resource should replace our get commands, right? Because a resource is something that we can interact with, and it returns values, right? That's the other piece of a resource, right? It's not that it just provides an API; it also returns data and values, right? Um, could I envision like an HTTP post resource? Absolutely, right? Because what are the errors that we're getting from that? Well, or what are the data we're getting from that? Some post endpoints return new IDs. Some post endpoints, return the new object. All post endpoints are going to return a success or failure, right? Um, so claiming that we shouldn't do post ignores the reality of a lot of APIs, right? Um, and so we need to be careful about the statements that we make um, because those statements can be taken as truth, right? And that's one of the things. Like um, as a streamer, I'm mostly here for entertainment, right? But I also have to recognize that a lot of people will take what I say and take that to work or take that other places. So I have to be very careful about, some of the stuff I say. Um, I'm going to agree with them that resource should not be used for post or put, but I will add that caveat that a lot of post and put endpoints are resources themselves, right? Um, so um, that that's one of the interesting things about the web is well I would say about life in general we have to be very careful about the absolutes that we put on things, right? As soon as I put an absolute on things, I've been very rigid in what I've said, um, and that rigidity forces me to either be inflexible or to break under counter examples. um, And so I want to be right. We shouldn't, maybe. I don't know. Um,
And that's where I'm saying we're kind of in a Wild West situation here. We're still in the Wild West with signals. Most people don't know where we need to draw the line for RxJS versus signals, right? Uh, where does that line belong? I don't know. I'm still experimenting and trying to figure out where I feel like that line belongs. And I don't even think the community's reached a consensus on that. Um, so there's a bit of a wild west situation there where everybody's kind of out doing their own thing, which is amazing because it's allowing us to have hundreds or thousands of experiments going on concurrently to figure out, oh yeah, this was a bad idea, or hey, this works really well, or right. So I think it's kind of the same way with resource is still in RFC, which means that it hasn't even been finalized by the Angular team. Once the Angular team finalizes it, it's going to take the community, typically it's about a year to 18 months before the community is like, yeah, these are the best practices, right? We've seen it blow up here. We've seen it blow up here. We've seen it succeed amazingly here, right? And so, like even in the stream today, I originally set my commands up to be signals. Um, but I'm realizing, hey, signals maybe weren't the right choice, right? So I'm still wild westing, I'm out there throwing up ideas and signposts and things and like, hey, this has worked for me. But just because it works for me doesn't mean that it's a best practice. Um, Once the community comes out with best practices, then we're going to turn around and I'm going to follow those best practices. But yeah, they seem very persistent with debouncing being an event and hence no signals. And I agree in principle, but in practice, I'm going to hack it, right? And that's the other thing. Man, you guys sniped me right at the end. I need to end here soon, but I started using HTTP resource for get in production, and I love it, especially when paired with linked. See, and that's the other piece that they called out. Linked signal was one of the key pieces. Once they came up with the idea of linked signal, a lot of the ideas that we're seeing now just kind of fell into place. Um, I had big long form with cascade dropdowns, and HTTP resource plus linked signal made it really easy. Oh, that sounds amazing, Kate Kansami. Um, that sounds like a perfect use case for HTTP resource and linked signal. Um, I actually really want to explore that idea. Very cool idea. Love it. And yeah, I agree with you, Michael, that uh, sometimes people say things, but the reality of software is most of most of the statements we make about software encompasses like the 80% of the 80/20 rule, right? Like 80% of software encompasses 80% of the rules, but there's that 20% where things don't fit, right? Um, and it's the same way with the statements we make. For 80% of the software written, HTTP resource probably should only be used for get commands, right? But there's that 20% where maybe that's not the case. It's the same thing with signals and things like that, right? Yeah, Cascade, that's really cool. Uh, anyway, I think we're in a good place. Our grid store is still messed up. Right, like our game one, we're having to go through and fix these all up. We'll fix these all up the next time. I'm I'm just trying to decide when the next time will be. We'll come back tomorrow evening and we'll finish this up. I want to get this resource done, and I want to focus on it. I don't think I have. Let me just check my calendar really quick before I wrap things up. Um, Yeah, I don't have anything tomorrow afternoon scheduled as of yet. So we'll plan on being back tomorrow. 5:30 Mountain Time. I know that's pretty late for like Europe and stuff, um, like Europe and India, and actually winds up being a good time for like Australia and parts of Asia. Um, so tomorrow, 5:30 p.m. Mountain, we'll be back. Um, we'll take a look at finishing up the Sudoku, like the resource portion of the Sudoku game. Um, what I'm curious about, and kind of on a resource kick, is next Sunday. Let's take a look at using a resource to generate themes. So providing like a theme resource for our application. I'm very, very curious about that. It's been an idea I've been kicking around for a little while. And so I would love to see if a theme resource makes sense. But to get there, um, we need to stream a few times this week to get like our unit tests taken care of, our resource taken care of, and right get our game back into a working state. Um, so yeah, thank you guys for being here. Thank you for all of the really really good questions. Like please feel free to come and ask questions. I look at this stream as a way to share my experience and knowledge with developers out there. Um, and a lot of times, the knowledge and experience I have is not related to Angular. Um, I use Angular as a vehicle for us to talk about concepts, mainly because I love Angular and I have a lot of fun writing Angular. Um, but in general, um, I look at this stream more as a way to help level level you guys up as developers. So if you guys have questions, even if it's not related to what we're talking about right now, please feel free to ask. I definitely want you guys to be comfortable coming and asking questions. And thank you so much for the questions that were asked today and the discussions we had and the comments. Um, I've got an amazing community. You guys are amazing. Thank you so much for being here. And we'll see you next time. You guys.